Thank you for joining us for updates to the Ontario Electricity Emissions Factors. We're going to share the new emissions factors report in the chat at the end of this meeting, and you'll also receive it by email tomorrow morning along with the slides and recording of this webinar. So feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself if you'd like and where you're calling in from. I'd like to acknowledge this land. Many of us are calling in from the region known by settlers as the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area, or GTHA. Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years include the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Erie, Neutral, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Our colleague Ekaterina is calling in from the traditional lands and territories of the Kwee-Kwetlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish, Kaikhite, and Stolo nations, referred to by settlers as the village of Anmore in BC. Emissions factors invite accuracy, precision, and transparency in our effort towards a low-carbon energy transition. But this work isn't mutually exclusive, with multiple Indigenous perspectives around accountability, stewardship, and responsibility to future
Hey,
generations.
Julie, sorry, can you pause? I think we might need to restart because it still says we're in a practice session, okay?
Okay.
Okay, 1 second. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulty. Just don't want to apologize, but I think we do have everyone in the live webinar now. So thank you. Good afternoon. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Julie Leach, and I'm the Senior Manager of Campaigns and Communications at TAF, or the Atmospheric Fund, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. So thank you for joining us for our updates to the Ontario electricity emissions factors. We're going to share the new emissions factors report in the chat at the end of this meeting. And by email tomorrow morning, you'll receive it with the slides and the recording of this webinar. Also, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself if you'd like and where you're calling in from. I'd like to acknowledge this land that many of us are calling in from in the region known by settlers as the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area, or GTHA. Indigenous people who have lived here for thousands of years include the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Erie, Neutral, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Our colleague Ekaterina is calling in from the traditional lands and territories of the Kwee-Kwetlam, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish, Kaikhite, and Stolo nations, referred to by settlers as the village of Anmore in BC. Emissions factors invite accuracy, precision, and transparency in our effort toward a low-carbon energy transition. This work isn't mutually exclusive with multiple Indigenous perspectives around accountability, stewardship, and responsibility to future generations. However, in addition to our collective work to do better research on decarbonization pathways, there is lots of work left to do to embrace Indigenous teachings about relational accountability and respect for the land. I invite all of us to consider how our work can support Indigenous reconciliation, including energy sovereignty and land back movements. Couple of quick housekeeping things. Please add your questions for our panelists using the Q&A function, so not the chat. Feel free to upvote good questions. We'll have a really good chunk of time after the presentation for a Q&A at the end. And again, we'll share the slides and recording by email to everyone who registered. Couple notes about us. TAF, or the Atmospheric Fund, is a nonprofit. We're a regional climate agency, and we invest in low carbon solutions in the GTHA and help bring them to scale. We invest our endowment in scalable clean tech projects and ventures and ethical funds. We run a grants program open to cities and nonprofits in our region, and we do policy research and analysis and advocacy and run various demonstration projects and programs related to buildings, transportation, and the electricity system. We'd like to thank the IESO for the data that made this report possible, including additional forecasting data that makes this year's edition even more robust. So thank you, because these emissions factors have huge engagement from all of you. So thanks, ISO, you're contributing to the overall advancement of this sector. Thank you to those who have consulted with TAF on this work and for you who are using them in yours. I'm going to introduce my colleagues now. They're the people behind this report and the recommendations. Many of you may know them. Katrina Sakova, Director of Research and Innovation, and Miriam Shakarisfard, Manager of Research and Innovation. So Katrina is going to kick off the presentation.
Thanks, Julie. So a little bit about the R&I Research and Innovation team specifically. In addition to looking after our carbon quantification efforts and research to advance TAF's mandate, one of the biggest projects we do every year is these electricity emission guidelines. We started releasing them a number of years ago, 9 years ago, according to my count, to assist practitioners, to assist you with quantifying the emission impacts of various decarbonization strategies. And we really see them as a key step in helping to identify and prioritize climate action strategies. So today, we're going to focus on presenting our updated guidelines, including new average emission factors for 2024, updated projections, and our expanded marginal emissions factors. We've also increased the number of use cases that are in the report to help you decide on what the most appropriate factor to use is. Then we'll look at Ontario's electricity grid and most recent forecasts from the Independent Electricity System Operator, the IESO, and we'll end with a few examples and policy recommendations. And I just want to mention that a lot of you submitted questions when registering, so we've planned the content around such that we can answer as many of those questions as possible throughout our presentation, but as Julie mentioned, there's also opportunity to ask more during the Q&A part. Next slide. Starting off, we're looking at the resources that powered Ontario's electricity grid last year. We saw that the mix was dominated by nuclear, just over half, and hydroelectric power, both of which are non-carbon emitting. And we also have, to a lesser extent, wind and solar at 9% of the mix. It is the gas-fired generation, however, that influences the electricity emissions intensity, and they represented 16% of total energy output last year. Now that portion is steadily increasing. It was a low of 4% in 2017, and last year when we looked at the 2023 data, it was about 13%. And we expect this to continue to grow. Next slide. This graph shows contracted supply in blue and demand in orange, sourced from ISO's 2025 APO, Annual Planning Outlook, and that's very similar to what was published last year as well. A couple things to note here. Over the next couple of years, there is a gap emerging between the projected demand and contracted supply. And while that gap is relatively small up until 2035, assume that gas-fired generation will need to ramp up to close it, driving up emissions in the near term. Next slide. Beyond 2035, it's not clear what resources are going to fill that gap as it increases significantly. And there's very much a lack of certainty from an emissions perspective of how much non-emitting resources are going to fill that gap. And I also want to point out that there's uncertainty in the demand line itself, which really depends on a lot of factors: the rate of technology adoption, improvements in efficiency, and so that can change what that line looks like. We do have the clean electricity regulations that dictate when and how we rely on gas-fired generation, and they do set emission limits to reduce the use of fossil fuel generation. However, a lot of the end-of-life provisions are expanded to allow fossil fuel facilities to operate for longer, and higher emission limits allow for greater utilization of gas plants. So bottom line, there's a lot of complexity here and a lot that can influence the future, which makes it tricky to predict the makeup of the grid. Next slide. As Julie mentioned, we received information from the IESO that shows the amount of gas that is on the margin, both historically and projected over the next 15 years. And we've had, I would say, the most amount of data to date we've received from the IESO, which is really fantastic. Gas here is the resource setting the market clearing price. And this trend shows that by 2027, gas is expected to be 100% on the margin. This is also the data that we use to generate our marginal emissions factors. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about best practices. These are largely coming out of the US, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. These organizations continue to recommend the use of marginal emissions factors to evaluate the impact of various applications, things like electricity-related policies, electrification projects, energy efficiency work, renewables, storage, all of that. And these factors represent a change in the emissions from marginal generation. So in other words, the generation that responds to a change in demand given at any given time. And they specifically take into account how a change in demand doesn't actually impact all generators equally. For Ontario, when there is a change in demand, natural gas is the primary generating resource that responds to those changes on the margin, where production is able to increase and decrease relatively quickly. Next slide. So in terms of best practice recommendations, I'll sort of first talk a little bit about it theoretically, then we'll get into the Ontario context. Recommendations are to use two types of marginal emissions factors. You have the short-run factors that are used for short-term assessments, where electricity, with their electricity grid does not structurally change as a result of a particular intervention. So the number of generators, transmission lines, all that remains fixed. And effectively, what that means is you're reserving short-run factors for specific use cases, load shifting, battery storage, etc. You then have long-run factors, which are recommended for all other scenarios. Those are the majority of applications like electrification, energy efficiency projects, etc. And we expect the grid to rebalance in those cases as a result of those interventions. Now, the US states that follow these best practices require the grid to rebalance using non-carbon emitting sources. Next slide. So the question everyone is here for, what are the best factors to use for Ontario? Well, once again, we're dividing it into two categories. So for evaluating short-term changes in demand, load shifting, etc., we continue to recommend the use of marginal emissions factors, MAFs. And this direction is the same as last year. This year, however, we have more information from the IESO, and we've been able to expand the number of MAFs that we're able to publish historically, as well as forecasted in the future to improve accuracy of assessments. And relatedly, this is where one of our key recommendations also comes from the need to publish historical marginal resource data at a greater granularity, so that we have clarity on how much natural gas is on the margin. That's really critical to be able to develop these types of factors. On the other hand, for evaluating long-term changes in demand, building electrification, energy efficiency, we continue to recommend the use of average emission factors as a proxy for long-run marginal factors. And this continues to be a proxy recommendation in the current policy climate and uncertainty in Ontario. With that, I'll pass things on to Miriam to discuss these factors in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Katrina. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is a decision guide we've put together to help you decide which emission factors to use in the common scenarios that we often see. And it guides you toward the appropriate factors for different purposes. The first question to ask is whether you are doing a carbon inventory for a company or a city, or if you're trying to understand the impact of a change or intervention, like a policy, program, or a project. So if you're doing an inventory or long-term planning or policy analysis of climate targets, then using historical or forecasted annual average emission factors is recommended. However, if you're doing an inventory and you want to conduct a precise analysis and you have hourly data, then using historical hourly average emission factors is more appropriate. Now, for changes and interventions, we have defined three popular project types. First, when we are evaluating the impact of long-term changes in demand. For example, projects involving fuel switching or energy efficiency, we recommend using historical or forecasted average emission factors in lieu of long-run marginal emission factors. Second, for interventions that evaluate the impact of short-term changes in demand, such as load shifting or battery storage, we recommend using historical or forecasted annual or seasonal marginal emission factors. And third, for projects involving new electricity generation, such as solar installations, we recommend using a combination of historical annual marginal emission factors and forecasted annual average emission factors in lieu of long-run marginal factors. So this blended approach provides a more balanced representation of both near-term system dynamics and long-term grid decarbonization trends. Now we are going to describe these factors one by one. Next slide, please. We'll start with the historical and annual average emission factors. These factors represent the average amount of carbon emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity consumed in Ontario. And they are calculated by dividing the total emissions from electricity production by the total electricity generated in a given year. To estimate these averages, we use a combination of IESO's electricity generation data and Canada's National Inventory Report NIR's estimates for the emission intensity of natural gas plants, as well as NIR's transmission and distribution loss factors. Noting that NIR's reported emissions intensity of natural gas plants has changed in their recent publication with a spike in 2021 and a drop in 2023. So this has caused some of our historic factors to have updated and changed slightly compared to last year's report. Also, just noting that Toronto Hydro already includes distribution losses in its consumption and billing data. So when using Toronto hydroelectricity data, adjustments are needed to avoid double counting, and we have provided guidance on how to do that in our report. And historically, we have chosen not to use NIR's electricity emission factors alone, as we noticed discrepancies between IESO and NIR in natural gas electricity generation in the previous years. And although the NIR factors are now corrected in their latest publication this year and are now more aligned with IESO's gas generation and our factors, we continue to use IESO data because it's more current without the 2-year lag and based on 7 data, whereas NIR relies on surveys of facility owners collected by Statistics Canada. We'll continue to monitor these differences over time. Annual average emission factors are best suited for calculating current and historical emissions, such as inventories, carbon footprints, or impact assessments. They can also serve as proxy, as mentioned, for long-term demand changes for cases like fuel switching, energy efficiency projects, building retrofit, or decarbonization studies. They are also relevant for policy assessment that affect the electricity grid's generation mix, or for estimating the impact of permanent new loads like data centers and large-scale electrification. As shown in this table, average emission factors have been increasing over the past few years, with a 24% rise in 2024, largely driven by higher natural gas generation on the grid during nuclear refurbishments and rising electricity demand. These emission factors, along with all the other ones that I'll show in the next few slides for the full set of years, are available in our downloadable data file in our website. Next slide, please. Now, hourly average emission factors reflect the average carbon intensity of electricity consumed in Ontario during any given hour, and then averaged across the year. They can be used to calculate emissions from current or historical electricity consumption, where a greater degree of precision is needed, and can be used for inventory and carbon footprint purposes. For example, they are useful when accounting for variable load operations, such as estimating a data center's electricity footprint that fluctuates with computing demand, or when calculating emissions from time-bound activities like the total emissions from charging an EV fleet over a year. In this chart, you can see that the 2024 hourly average emission factors compared to previous years being higher primarily due to increased natural gas generation. Next slide, please. In many cases, we want to understand the impact of changes in electricity consumption in the future. For example, over the operational life of a heat pump. For these cases, the use of forecasted emission factors is more accurate. We have developed the forecasted average emission factors to 2050 using IESO's 2025 APO model potential scenario in their capacity expansion cost and emissions module, which is a potential pathway for meeting future electricity demand rather than actual procurement outcomes. We use the IESO APO's forecast both for electricity generation and the natural gas plant's emission intensity, and then applied NIR's transmission and distribution loss factors to estimate the forecasted emission factors. Emissions are forecasted to increase every year in the next 5 years before gradually decreasing and leveling off by 2050. And as you know, IESO's forecast changes over time due to new policies and technological developments. So there's a considerable amount of uncertainty about this forecast, especially as we look further into the future. And although these changes can lead to significant variations in the forecast, we use the most up-to-date and accurate information available to generate the projected factors. Next slide, please. This chart compares grid electricity emissions based on TAP's updated 2025 estimates, shows in dotted blue, with the IESO's 2025 APO in lighter green, and other lines show IESO's 2024 scenarios, including as-is, high nuclear, and 6 graphs report. You notice that historical emissions don't fully align between TAF and the IESO 2025, mainly because IESO, which uses NIR data for their historical emissions reporting, hasn't yet updated its historical emissions that NIR has since corrected. Starting in 2025, though, the projections are consistent between TAF and IESO. We also compared these forecasts with forecasted grid emissions from NIR's 2024 report and Canada Energy Regulators, the CER's Energy Future 2023 report, which was the latest report for them, under different forecasted net zero and additional measure scenarios. The IESO scenario shows about 2.5% higher emissions than both CER and NIR. It's worth noting that these are all modeled scenario based on assumptions and not actual plans or regulations or any confirmed pathways. Looking ahead, emissions are expected to decline over time, but there is still a lot of uncertainty, and natural gas is projected to stay the marginal resource for most hours over the next 5 years. And because recent IESO procurements have been fuel neutral, we could see more new gas capacity than projected. So even though the long-term trend is downward, achieving those reductions will depend on major operational and policy decisions in the years ahead. Next slide, please. Now, marginal emission factors, as Catherine mentioned, natural gas power plants in Ontario are often used to respond quickly to changes in the demand. This means that they are the main drivers behind marginal emissions. We have calculated historical annual marginal emission factors based on the percentage of gas on the margin during each month and year between 2015 and 2024 which was provided to us by the ISO. For evaluating the impact of short-term changes in the demand, for example, when estimating impacts of incremental load changes or load shifting strategies, like evaluating the effectiveness of smart systems for peak hour reduction like thermostats, or calculating the carbon value of demand response programs, or informing real-time dispatch decisions like turning on large industrial machines or load balancing. Or in cases where we are estimating avoided emissions through battery storage or high-resolution load shifts like EV charging, then the use of the math is recommended. Next slide, please. We use ISO's provided forecast for the percentage of natural gas on the margin to estimate the expanded set of marginal emission factors, which include both forecasted annual and seasonal factors for peak and off-peak periods. We recommend applying these marginal factors in all the cases mentioned in previous slide for historical math, like load shifting, battery storage, or local generation impact in future. Next slide, please. Now let's walk through some of the report examples to get a better sense of how we use these factors. And the first example is an EV charging scenario where we have EV's hourly electricity consumption data for 1 year in 2024 for a multifamily residential buildings, and we want to estimate the total carbon footprints across the entire year. Next slide, please. Here is the data we have, which is hourly consumption starting from January 1st all the way to the end of the December. Next slide. We have aggregated this consumption across the year by hour. So here you'll see the aggregated data for each hour and the total aggregated consumption numbers. Next slide. Finally, we applied the 2024 hourly average emission factors to consumption data to estimate the emissions for each hour, and then sum them up to come up with the total emissions. Depends on your purpose, you can look at the total emissions or certain hours to see which hours have the highest emissions to inform the types of the decision you are making. Next slide. Our second example is about calculating the difference in carbon emissions when electrifying a building's heating system. Next slide. So there has been a feasibility study done on the building revealing the following information. And of course, we've simplified it for the purpose of for this example. But generally speaking, there's a decrease in natural gas consumption by replacing the existing heating system, and there is an increase in electrical consumption as a result of electrifying the building. Next slide. To estimate the difference in carbon emissions, you take the impact of the intervention and subtract the impact of the base case. So here we have the electrical consumption multiplied by the average emission factor for 2024, and then you subtract the gas emission saving, which is gas consumption multiplied by natural gas factor, to estimate the total savings in carbon emissions per year. And if you were to look at the impact over a number of years in the future, you would use the forecasted annual average emission factor we provide those up to 2050 in our guideline report. We have also a solar example as well in the report, and we provide the detailed calculations in the downloadable file to help provide a bit more of complicated examples around electricity generation. So as always, we are here in case there is a specific question about use cases or calculations. You can always reach us. And with that, I'll pass things to EK to discuss the recommendations.
Thanks, Miriam. Let me just get my video back up. So the factors and guidelines that we recommend and we've gone through today are developed based on the data that we have access to, and they're really, of course, influenced by the policy environment in which we currently operate in. And to help address some of the gaps that we've talked about today, we have two main recommendations. The first one is data related. So even though the ISO publishes hourly generation and capacity data, we use this data to develop our average emission factors. It's still challenging to understand which resource is operating on a margin at any given time. And so including this as regularly published data available to everybody is really going to equip practitioners with a better understanding of the carbon benefits associated with load shifting and those short-term changes in demand. The second recommendation is to the province. We need to ensure that new demand is met through non-emitting supply to realize the full benefits of electrification. Now, I'm certain no one is shocked by this recommendation. We've certainly been advocating for this for a long time now, same as many of you here today, but this is absolutely critical. And I'd like to bring us back to that graph that Miriam showed in the grid emissions. I see a couple of questions popping up. I can go over sort of which of the lines are what. It seems like our legend was missing a couple of key pieces of information, but that graph really shows significant, I would say that graph really represents significant uncertainty in the long-term forecasts, especially since gas-fired generation in Ontario is expanding. And locking in natural gas this way, especially with these types of investments that are long-term, makes it much more difficult to be on track with the emissions decreases that were shown on the second part of that graph. And if our comms navigator can maybe just go back to that slide, I'll just quickly go over what line is what, and we'll certainly type that in the answer period as well. But just so everybody's clear on that slide. Oh, it seems like the legend is there. So we got the green line is the annual planning outlook for the IESO. The orange line is the 2024 APO as is scenario. That's from last year. Same as the orange dotted line. That's the high nuclear case. The light gray line is the ISO 6 graphs. If some of you might remember the 6 graphs that were published last year. And then the sort of dashed blue line, that's the TAF 2025 guidelines. So you see that one effectively matches the APO, the 2025 APO after 2025. So I'm glad that the legend is magically back on. But I'll leave it at there, and I'll over to Julie for our Q&A period.
Thanks so much, EK and Miriam. And I'm pretty sure nobody on our team actually went back and updated that legend. So something incredible happened there. Thanks. And yeah, we're going to kick off the Q&A now. I wanted to first address, we had a few questions come in through registration that were really excellent questions. I think EK and Miriam have answered some of them. We did get a lot of questions about, how is the province tracking against their climate targets and the federal government. And, we had questions about what progress is underway. And so we did want to acknowledge that since this time we met last year, there has been some progress towards decarbonizing electricity. The IESO launched their Electricity Conservation and Demand Side Management, or EDSM, framework with a budget of almost $11 billion. And so, that's a 12-year plan, almost $1 billion a year. IESO is also procuring new renewable energy projects for the first time in a decade, which is great to see. Although, as EK mentioned, we'd like to see, a bit more focus on non-emitting resources. To understate it, maybe the current procurement by the IESO ignores emissions completely, and so we'd support, restricting future procurements to non-emitting generation, or at least rewarding renewable energy through emissions-based criteria. We also think that the province should address red tape related to renewable energy development, including lifting the offshore wind moratorium. So hopefully that answers some of the questions that came in through registration. And we'll get started on some of your questions coming in live. And I see this one has already been answered, or Miriam, perhaps you're wanting to respond to it. It says, this one comes in from Scott. Can the historical hourly AEFs be provided for each month versus one profile for the entire year?
Sure. Thanks, Scott, for that great question. We have developed hourly average emission factors as well as the yearly. We have not specifically generated monthly for this publication. We used to generate that in the previous editions, but this is something that's possible. We have all the Gladner hourly data, but for the purpose of not providing too many factors and for that purpose, we have only published the hourly and the annual average emission factors.
Great, thanks, Miriam. And another question in from an anonymous attendee. I know this did get addressed a little bit during the presentation, but Ekaterina, if you could clearly state just the difference between the federal NIR, so the National Inventory Report, emissions factors for electricity for Ontario versus the findings in our report. So they're curious about the sources of the differences and why these factors should be used for emissions inventories.
Yeah, absolutely. And also like to expand on that question as well. So last year we had a number of discussions with NIR and IESO regarding the ways to close the gap and some of the gaps that we've been seeing in the factors. Really happy to see that since those meetings that data has been corrected. And so the 2023 NIR factors are very much aligned. Overall, I do just want to mention there have been some additional corrections from the NIR's reported emission intensity of natural gas plants. That has changed in sort of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So some of you might see that our historic factors have also been updated slightly compared to last year's report. So just wanted to mention that was related to that. But overall, we do see better alignment with what NIR has corrected, and hopefully that's gonna, we're not gonna kind of go back to seeing differences in the data going forward. We did also a comparison between IESO, NIR, and CR's forecasted grid electricity emissions. So those are the forecasts. And IESO's modeled scenarios show a slightly higher share of natural gas present in the fuel mix, about 2.5% higher than CR. And so it's important to note that there are certainly discrepancies in some of the, I would say differences in some of the forecasts that are being modeled. So that's something to keep an eye on. And I also wanted to kind of expand looking, some of you, we've met and talked about what was in the National Building Codes and some of the electricity emission factors there, which are sourced from ECCC's projections, the average projections between 2031 and 2035. And those factors are slightly lower, a couple of grams per kilowatt hour, slightly lower than the average emission factors in these guidelines that we released this year. So there still are small, discrepancies here and there, especially when it comes to forecasts, because it's important to keep in mind there's sometimes different assumptions that are used to develop these forecasts. So I would say in choosing what's the best available factor, or at least looking at reports that use certain factors, definitely looking at the sources of where these factors are coming from and who's generated them is important. But overall, it is great to see better alignment. We're starting to see that alignment coming in, and we hope that continues in the future.
Great. And this question, how can you explain that the AEF, so the average emissions factors, are expected to rise in the coming years? Is it because natural gas will be used to fill the gap between supply and demand? Maybe for Ekaterina.
Yeah, sure. I can certainly start things off. So, yeah, the trend is both average emission factors and actually marginal emission factors to rise in the near term. Specifically for the average emission factors, they're projected to peak, in the next couple of years before, kind of gradually declining in the future. And that's really because the potential scenario from IESO's CapEx model assumes that gas will be used to fill that gap. And so really this is, it represents a modeling assumption, right, to create these future projections. I do want to stress that there, is an opportunity to address this, and there's certainly momentum behind solutions, and some of which you mentioned, Julie. I really like to emphasize, prioritizing non-emitting generation in any future bulk electricity procurements, and certainly providing criteria points for non-emitting generation. That's a way to prioritize. And we also, mentioned more kind of moratorium, ending the offshore wind moratorium. Really, any way to remove the barriers, remove the red tape that is currently limiting renewable energy development is really key. So that's going to make it easier to increase solar, battery storage, things like that. And that's a way to reduce some of the impacts that are forecasted. And certainly that's a really key way in once again, keeping in mind that emissions decrease, beyond 2035, 2040, 2050. If we want to be on that projection, on that line, on track with that, those reductions, we have to start thinking about these things now.
Thanks, EK. This question from Adam. Do you agree with the use of average emissions factors when evaluating carbon emissions impacts of new construction? So, for example, the TGS, the Toronto Green Standard, that one for EK?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that as going back to that category, when to use average emission factors, when to use marginal emission factors. Those types of interventions are really part of the average emission factors where we have changes, great changes. And looking at improving new construction, so building more efficient buildings, I think falls very much into that category. So we would recommend using average emission factors. And that's really, that recommendation continues to be a proxy recommendation. We're currently not able to generate long-run marginal emission factors. So in lieu of that, we're recommending practitioners use average emission factors. So anything to do with building electrification, all right, a new building that is using, let's say, heat pumps. Anything to do with energy efficiency, we would recommend using average emission factors.
Okay, great. And this question is for Miriam. It comes from Richard. Thank you for the excellent presentation and your work on emissions. Is the TAP team familiar with Watt Time? I believe we do use Watt Time as a tool. We look at their real-time marginal emissions factors. Can you give us a bit of a background on that?
Thanks, Richard, for this great question. Yes, we have been familiar with Watt Time, and we have had collaborations with them this year and obtained their marginal emission factors data and made comparisons with TAF after we received the IESO's percentage gas on the margin, and we were able to generate those historical marginal emission factors. What we noticed that Watt Times with the great robust methodology, their emission factors were higher than TAF, and the reason is that they are accounting for imports and export in their methodology. In TAF's methodology, emissions from imported electricity are treated as having zero emissions. Most of Ontario's import come from Quebec and Manitoba, which have lower zero emissions. However, Watt Times approach assigns imports to Ontario as having the marginal impacts on natural gas. Since when importing to Ontario, they reduce export to US markets, which then needs to backfill by gas generation. So because of that reason, and we see those differences in TAF method versus Watt Times method.
Thank you. So I'm just going down to find this question. Yes, this one from James for EK. So does TAF release or track residual mix emissions factors, accounting for the registration and sales of clean energy credits?
We don't, and maybe I would just turn Miriam for the details of that question.
That's right, EK. We are not tracking it as part of our numbers and method. We don't account for the datasets.
Okay. Thank you, Miriam. And this question is coming in about the forecasted 2025 to 30 MEF table. Oh, I see that maybe a mislabeling. So we'll revisit that, Larry, and get back to you and confirm. Has TAF produced emissions factors based on Ontario average outdoor temperature from 21 degrees Celsius down to minus 30 degrees to determine impact of electric heat pump transfer to backup power? That one for EK maybe?
I would say again that a short answer is no. I'm just trying to think in real time if looking at our marginal emissions factors, because this would be a short term change in a specific time of use, seasonal. I would say that's probably the best proxy looking at our marginal emissions factors. We forecasted what those would be seasonal, and I'd say that would be a fairly decent approximation, but we haven't done kind of a specific analysis based on those types of temperatures.
Thanks for that answer. From Trevor McLeod, do any of the IESO or TAF projections account for pumped storage projects that are potentially slated to come online towards the end of the decade? We looked at pump storage.
Maybe I'll take this one on. I would say other than what's maybe already baked into the ISO projections, I wouldn't say directly our factors sort of have a correction or taking that into account. It's really looking at what our factors are based off of, what the ISO projections and specifically what the 2025 APO projections look like. So to the extent those are already baked in there, yes. But it's not like we have a specific correction that would take into account for that.
Okay, and this next question comes from Reza. I think this one is more for Miriam. Reza is asking, what is the difference between the TAF and IESO emissions factor databases? Which one follows or feeds into the other? And which resource is recommended for fuel switching and net zero projects?
Thanks, Reza, for this question. So we use ISO's generation data to develop our emission factors. So basically, ISO's data feeds into our methods. And right now, there is a great alignment between TAF and ISO, apart from that historical factors, which we are waiting for ISO's next publication update to see if it's now updated based on corrected factors by NIR to see that alignment there too. But overall, and especially for the forecasted emission factors, factors are now pretty much aligned. The only thing is that in the APO ISO, they report on grid emission intensity. So we, on top of that, apply the electricity transmission and distribution loss factors, which we obtain from NIR, and apply on top of that to estimate the consumption emission intensity. So that's the difference, I guess, that we can use TAF's emission factors as a consumer to estimate the consumption emission intensity for the fuel switching or other net zero projects purposes.
Back to that graph that showed the historical, and actually a follow-up question to that one was just around why are the historical emissions different? And I think you're just waiting for ISO to update, right, their historical.
That's true, because ISO, for their historical, what they report on emission factors and emissions overall in their APO, they rely on NIR's report for their historical reporting. So it takes time, I guess, for NIR APO to, in their next report, to update the corrected factors by NIR to hopefully see that alignment coming next year.
Okay. So TAF is just a little
And
bit faster than the federal government at updating those numbers. Is that right? Okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks for clarifying. So this question is from,
and maybe
sorry, go ahead.
Julie, sorry, just to answer, I believe it was a question from Larry. That's yeah, those are marginal emissions factors. Those are the maths. I think the table just had the wrong title on it. So in our full report that is published as of right now, we also have downloadable data tables. So you can see all the factors categorized: average, marginal, historic, forecasted. So those numbers are certainly for marginal emissions factors.
Okay, great. And another question about the forecasts from Kevin. He's asking to identify the primary driver behind that second spike. So around 2039, there's a spike in emissions. Is this due to a nuclear refurbishment schedule, or do you know what that spike is?
Thanks for that question, Kevin. We tried to look at the ISO's data. Well, obviously, it was not a clear explanation on, but just looking at the fuel mix, there we realized that there are much less nuclear generation and renewable generations in 2039, but more natural gas generation. So it could be explained by some nuclear refurbishment or end of the contract of some of the electricity generation plants. Again, I could not find a clear sort of explanations or reason, but this is the trend that we noticed, that there's more natural gas filling there to to compensate that the other lower generation from other plants.
Thanks, Miriam. And this question from Hamid, it could be for either Ike or Miriam. Are you considering including historical and forecasted utility unit costs for Class A and B customers in Ontario? These data, combined with GHG emissions factors, could significantly support decarbonization efforts and the development of on-site renewables. Would either of you like to answer that one?
Yeah, maybe I'll take it certainly first. Yeah, that's something that we're thinking about. I would say also, there's different ways to determine factors. And actually, in the past, we did, you look at a cost and market price-based approaches. And you can look at percent of gas on the margin, which we certainly adopted in the last couple of years. Before we were able to get that information, we certainly looked at other kind of approximations. But since we've been able to receive data directly from the ISO, we use that sort of as the most reasonable approximation to generate those factors. So we certainly, we'll keep an eye. I'm curious to think of how that Class A, Class B can impact the factors, and we can certainly take a deeper look. But it does have an impact. Ultimately, we want to make sure that our factors are grounded in, I would say, the most accurate information. And so that's sort of also a reason why we've gone over to percent of gas on the margin as a way to determine these factors. But we can certainly keep an eye on it.
Thank you. And we have time for one or two more questions. This one for Ekaterina. According to TAF, what would be a high impact policy or data transparency change beyond publishing these factors that, if executed at the IESO level, could help municipalities or building owners confidently use hourly or sub-hourly signals to shift load away? Oh, the question just moved, sorry. So I lost it. Yeah, to shift load away basically from high energy intensive sources.
So, the best way to estimate what the benefits of that load shifting would be is to use marginal emission factors. And so, having, this goes back to our recommendations, and especially to the ISO, having access to, what is on the margin. How much gas is going to be on the margin is really important historically. In terms of future projections, we do also think that information should be published and it should be regularly published every year, rather than it be sort of indirectly published through the factors that we create. We get access to that data and then we create those factors. So we think data transparency is really important, and that's really going to make it more clear and more accurate to anticipate the impact of these short-term changes and signal to industry. How can we, what the benefits are going to be, what the carbon benefits are going to be from that fuel switching. And, going back to some of our, I would say, larger recommendations, the key thing for the province to think about is prioritizing that non-emitting generation. And once again, that's sounding a little bit like a broken record, but there are differences what is expected to happen in the near term and what is expected to happen in the long term. And we really look at those sort of long term, hey, the emissions are decreasing on paper, and that is sort of a trend that we all hope for. But at the same time, it's not grounded in reality if we continue to rely on natural gas and gas-fired generation. So, it the trend with increasing these factors certainly doesn't impact the case for electrification. We do want to be clear, there's very much a case for electrification, and there continues to be a case for electrification. But to realize those benefits fully into the future, we need to, start bending that curve and start looking at the way procurement is going. Because once everything is locked in, it becomes harder to change over time.
Mhm. These are really rich questions, and we're not going to be able to get through all of them. I think many of you on this call might have also some feedback and suggestions on some of them. I think it's discussion that will continue with many of you. And a reminder that we'll also publish the annual carbon emissions inventory for the GTHA, and we'll have a little bit more detail on our policy recommendations and recommendations for corporations, building owners, etc., broader sector recommendations. So thank you for your excellent questions. I think we're doing our best to answer those related to emissions factors directly, and we'll have some follow-up on some of the others. Thanks, Eric from CanRIA, who mentioned DERs, distributed energy resources, in the chat. And of course, we're also working hard to make the case for and advocate for distributed energy resources like distributed solar and storage. You'll hear more from TAF about that in the coming months. And a reminder that if you are working on conservation and demand side management and any DERs, we do have a grants program, and these projects are eligible for grant funding. So get in touch. As a comms person, I'm also interested in how to get more uptake and see better promotion of some of these programs. But there's been a lot of progress from the LDCs, from the local utilities, on demand side management and DERs. So it's great to see that progress. We're blogging about it and trying to champion your great work. So thanks to the cities, the municipalities, and LDCs working hard on those programs, as well as other decarbonization projects that we'd love to continue talking to you about. So certainly sign up for the emissions inventory webinar happening next month. We'll send a reminder out. As we promised, we are sharing the report by email. Here is the direct link to the report, but you'll also receive this in your email along with the slides and the recording. Thanks again to my colleagues, Katrina and Miriam, and the whole research and innovation team, including Pat Romanen, who's helping behind the scenes, and Sandra and Colleen on the comms team for helping out with the technical troubleshooting today. And thank you for this important hard work. Please get in touch with us if we didn't get to your question. Thanks and have a fantastic afternoon, everyone.